Thank you, everyone. Just a little bit of personal speak before I begin. I firstly want to thank you for inviting me, Anna, and for being a part of this day. Like everyone else, I really want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, past, present and future. And I also just want to say thank you for the personal stories. Personal stories create so much understanding in this space, and it's really important to hear each other's voices, and it's been a pleasure to be a participant. As Anna was reading out a little bit about my work, I just also want to touch on a couple of things. So my main focus is Youth Wellbeing Project, which I'll speak to in a minute, my work with schools education. But I've just spent the last 4 years working with Dr. Gail Dines with Culture Reframed. Many of you would be familiar with her work in this space. And developing a parents program to address the impacts of pornography and build resilience and resistance in kids to porn's impacts. So I really encourage you to check out Culture Reframed. That'll be the only opportunity I have to highlight that work. And also internationally, I'm working on some with Connecting to Protect and looking at legislation and advocacy and applying a public health approach to this issue of pornography. So there's quite a bit of other things that I have going on other than what I'll speak to now, which is Youth Wellbeing Project. We're promoting safe and healthy relationships free from tech and sexualised harms through research-based education. So we do a lot of schools education, presentations, programs for teachers to deliver in schools to address this issue. And even as I was speaking to someone before at lunchtime, you know, we must start in primary school with this topic, and as I go through, you will fully understand why. I've written a couple of children's books, and I know that everybody listening here would be a mum or a sister or an auntie or a grandma, or would have some connection to what our children are going through, and we can't underestimate the impact of this issue on them enough. I myself saw pornography at the age of 6 years old. I was profoundly impacted that day, and not having anybody to speak to or talk to about that, I internalized those messages and I engaged in child-on-child sexual abuse as a result of that. And that's why I'm so passionate about this, because what I saw then in a magazine is a fraction of what is available now. And having been a fierce advocate in this area for the last 6 years, specifically addressing this topic, we're starting to finally see some movement, but I also feel as though it's slipped off the radar of many conversations, as there's all of these other really important topics that impact girls and women, but pornography is just not highlighted enough in political spaces, and is just not given enough attention, and there is ample evidence to say that we need to take more action. The impacts of porn extend well beyond the individual impacted by porn, and it contributes to the collective environment, the toxic and abusive culture, online and offline, that our girls and women are involved in. This was highlighted even just last week. The Guardian produced an article, The Trouble with Boys, What Lies Behind the Flood of Teenage Sexual Assault Stories. And pornography was certainly highlighted as one of the main factors that's contributing to sexual assault in our schools. Now, this was inspired by a young woman who, she was a Sydney schoolgirl, or past schoolgirl, I think she's 23 now, and her name escapes me, I'm so sorry. But she called for a petition for, or people to fill out a form, a Google form, and I think it's still active, for young women to tell their stories of when they finished school and what their experience was of abuse within schools. This one makes me laugh. It's pretty much the same article, except it's, this was published 2 hours earlier. but the dark secret at some of Sydney's most elite schools. Now, if we think it's only happening in elite schools, we're kidding ourselves. It is happening in every single school across this country. And unfortunately, when we're not talking about pornography, I mean, we can talk about sex education and we can give our kids good sex education from a young age, but if we're not talking about and helping them prepare in advance for the messages that they're going to get the older they get from pornography, if we're not building resilience in them from a young age to recognize those harmful messages, they get swept up into a culture, an online culture. They get one of these, way too young, and they don't have the critical thinking skills necessary to push back against these cultural messages, and we're losing a couple of generations of young people to accept abuse in their relationships, to not have the skills to challenge that. So it's really important that we raise this issue even more than what it has been in the past. So pornography influences sexual violence. I put in a submission recently to the Family Domestic Sexual Violence inquiry, federal inquiry. There's no findings yet. I hold my breath and hope that my 30+ page research submission does something. But it wouldn't be uncommon if it didn't, because there's been various submissions that I've put in over the past, cyberbullying, for instance, explaining how pornography, it contributes to online sexual harassment, and not one word came through on the end of the findings to acknowledge that. So there's a real disconnect between what's going on in schools and what's happening at policy level, because nobody wants to think that kids are actually looking at porn. So in the submission, I detail things, and I highlight this because you can go and you can read all the research. I don't have an awful lot of research in here, but there is ample research, so I will direct you to that website link at the bottom. But it shapes sexual scripts, thereby influencing child and youth attitudes and behaviours, and as such, their social environment. It's a how-to measure children engaging in sexually abusive behaviours towards other children, as it was for me. It influences youth sexual violence towards peers and children, and neurodiverse and disabilities children are particularly vulnerable in this area. Influences sexual harassment, gender-based norms and other harmful social norms. It motivates sexual offences such as rape, sexual harassment, strangulation and other consensual and non-consensual sex acts that cause emotional and physical harm. Now, the reason why I put consensual in there is because in porn-based culture, what is consent? When she's having her head thrust down, hair pulled, and she somehow has to look like she's enjoying that, and she's saying yes when every fibre in her being's probably saying no, then what does consent look like when porn is the main sex educator? It's incredibly confusing for our young women. It impacts women's relationships, betrayal trauma, capitulating to abuse, and industry abuses for women in the industry. You don't ask a woman in the industry about the abuse, you wait for the survivors who walk out the other end and they need the pieces picked up. Because, there's something about the industry where women in the industry justify and rationalise, and often it's the trauma of the industry when they leave that they finally realise that that was not what was really true to them. Influences adults to digress to child sexual exploitation material and abuses against children. We have a whole new generation of pedophiles that are not technically pedophiles. What do I mean by that? Clinical definition of pedophilia that I don't have in front of me, but it's basically being attracted to children from a young age right through and not growing out of that attraction to children. But what we have now is adult men watching pornography who get bored and digress to end up watching, of course, teen sex is very common in pornography as a genre, and so it's not such a hard stretch to then end up watching child sexual exploitation material. It's a grooming tool for use by sexual offenders and a tool in and of itself that grooms children and normalises abuse.
And it's a model for technology-facilitated abuses, including sexting, upskirting, downblousing, image-based abuse, and deepfakes. If you haven't been on a porn website recently, here's the definition that I frequently use. It's illegal, unclassified, gonzo or hardcore XXX, free online material, rational, sane place. It would not be allowed for children to access. The laws of this country are such that if I came through customs with a suitcase full of X-rated videos, I would be denied entry, but I can bring it through with my phone in my back pocket. I can even watch it on the airline and nobody would bat an eyelid. Gonzo is the angle of the camera, up close and personal, on the point of action, penis in orifice, or multiple orifices, or multiple penises. It's basically that up close and front, up close shot in our schools. Normalization is the process of an idea or behaviour going from clearly problematic to an accepted part of societal culture. And that's where we find ourselves now. And what's happened is the normalization has altered sexual scripts. Now we all develop our own sexual scripts, but with young people we need to counteract the stories that porn tells kids and youth. So if we take a look at the development of a sexual script and the role of sexual media here on the right, if that is the main messaging, which increasingly, in the absence of proper sex education or good conversations in the home, increasingly porn is the default. So sexual media becomes the main source of information, and what these researchers did was developed a framework around, of course, not the only other influences, but usually the typical influences are the messages that kids get from their family, from their peers, and from their romantic partners, to develop our ideas about sex and the stories that we tell ourselves about sex. So what happens when conversations in the family are absent and sex education at school, for a whole pile of reasons in this country, overcrowded curriculum, I think we've actually regressed in effectiveness in sex education in many schools. Peers are getting the same messages from sexual media, romantic partners are getting the same messages from sexual media. It becomes the norm. To counteract these, we need positive sexual scripts, early, persistent, and reinforced. So go on is the chat. Our kids have these devices in their pockets so often that we need to be equally, if our kids have got these devices, we need to be equally persistent in messaging to counteract these social norms. Essentially what's happening for a large percentage of particularly young men, and I don't want to say only young men, but there are young women who are addicted to porn too, but pornography is having a profound impact on the brain. And what so many people don't realise is that pre-internet erectile dysfunction, and for women arousal disorders, but I only have the figures for men, erectile dysfunction was at rates of 2 to 3%. Now it's around 33% of men are experiencing some form of erectile dysfunction, and a vast majority of that is attributed to hardcore pornography. Our young men, education with them is absolutely vital if we want our young women to have safe spaces. Often young men will see porn years and years and years before their first kiss, before their first touch, and they'll have 10 years of watching hardcore porn under their belt and then go to have a sexual relationship and either expect that of their partner or then not be able to be aroused because of rewiring their brain to pixels instead of people. So that sexual conditioning is the cues learned about opportunities for reproduction and behaviour, so that's a step up from the sexual scripting. Another definition is a behavioural process. A response becomes more frequent or predictable as a result of reinforcement. And that reinforcement is a stimulus or reward that produces a desired response. So you can see how this is a really difficult conversation to get through in schools and to get through even in homes, because our sexuality is personal. And we have to give our young people messages about how a multi-billion-dollar industry does not care about their sexual health. And so that is often the approach that we take when we're going to schools and educate. Firstly, porn doesn't care for you whatsoever. And so we've got to challenge those messages. Is it helpful? Is it healthy? And is it safe? Statistically, there was a study done in 2018, online sexually explicit material exposure to, desire for, and participation in rough sex. They found that it's common for those who have been exposed to rough sex and pornography to both desire and engage in those acts. Rough sex is defined as hair pulling, spanking, scratching, biting, bondage, fisting, and double penetration. 91.4% of 19 to 30-year-olds surveyed who had been exposed to porn desired to engage in one or more of these behaviours. 81.7% had engaged in one or more, and almost half of the study participants had engaged in 4 or more rough sex behaviours. It's really showing that correlation there. I put this graph together to help our politicians, in clear language, understand the impact of porn on influencing the instigators of sexual abuse, including predators, and normalising sexual abuse for victims. So we can see we've got the pathways from 18 plus up the top there. We've got an adult instigator, can be triggered or influenced to engage in adult on teen violence. We have teen victims, we have a teen instigator and peer on peer. We have teen on child, we have child on child, and we have adult on child. We also have adult on adults with adult victims. Adults in the home using porn together or solo that impacts on that safety environment for the child. And we have both technology facilitated abuse and we have contact abuse. Porn normalizes the literature. Whilst there's still always more research that we can have, we don't need to wait anymore to wait for the research. Common sense will tell you that this is a massive issue. And even in the period of COVID, we've seen such a rise in child sexual exploitation, like 600% rise in reports of child sexual exploitation, reports of children being groomed online because kids have been at home and often in their room on devices and being groomed. So what do we do about it? Education is absolutely essential. I really do encourage you to go to our website. I've got research on there, I've got blogs, I've got a link to Porn Resilient Kids, one of our initiatives where I've written 2 children's books and provide advice for parents of under the age of 12. I've also got a Parent Help 101 page on the Youth Wellbeing Project website, and here you'll find links to the Culture Reframe Parents Program. You'll find links to resources to have conversations. You'll find links to a new mobile phone called Gme that drastically reduces the likelihood of kids stumbling across porn because the safety features are built inside the phone. So when the kid at 11 or 12 is begging for a mobile device, this is a far better option to keep them safer. We've seen some good action internationally, I'm very pleased to say. Have you heard of the Trafficking Hub campaign? Yeah, over 2 million signatures. Layla Micklewade has done a great job driving that. There's hundreds of organisations, including my own, that signed up to support that and put our name to it. Now this inspired a New York Times article that was published, I believe, on the 5th of December, which triggered a whole series of events, which is very exciting. We've had, how much time have I got?
Very close.
Very close? Okay. So we have Visa and MasterCard withdrawal services, which is great. And I guess the key piece is that there is a current investigation or inquiry happening in the Canadian Parliament into Pornhub's antics, and we hope to push that to the nth degree. So if you haven't yet got behind that campaign, or you want to be involved, talk to me later and I can help you find the right location to be involved with that. Legislation. There was a report handed down in February 2020 that I was involved in writing a submission to under the banner of eChildhood, a charity that I co-founded and am no longer with. They issued a report of the inquiry into age verification for online wagering and online pornography, protecting the age of innocence. They made 6 recommendations for age verification. It was handed down just before COVID hit, and nothing's happened. But that will go a long way to reducing children's access to pornography and a long way to helping us fight this. What we want to see is age verification underpinned by safety, security and privacy. This diagram is available on the connectingtoprotect.org website that I'm co-chair of that organisation. But the thing that concerns me most around this, I just want to get this out in the public sphere really clearly, I am concerned about our governments misusing age verification for the purposes of surveillance and monitoring of everyday citizens. So I think we need to be really careful and mindful of who are making our decisions, and that we're on the forefront of opposing any such restrictions. So I want to thank you all, and please don't hesitate to talk to me after.